Mr. Mary, thank you very much for coming to Voice of America today. Just last week, Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry published a list of people, a blacklist basically of experts and politicians and others, where your name also was there, basically considering you a persona non grata. Where is this going in your view? What's the logic behind the list, and what is Azerbaijan saying with this?
This list has one thing in common, that everyone on it, roughly 360 people, have at some point in recent years visited Karabakh. That's the problem. Azerbaijan is trying to prevent people from visiting Karabakh and is essentially blacklisting them if they do. They have done this to some rather famous people. The very famous Spanish opera singer Montserrat Caballé, to two astronauts, including one man who's actually walked on the moon, has been put on this blacklist. I think it's really a very unfortunate practice, not just because my name is on the list, but because it is quite contrary to Azerbaijan's own interest to try to keep people away from its own territory who might be in a position to make some comment about the nature of Azerbaijan's dispute with Armenia. I would propose to Azerbaijan that rather than blacklisting people who visited Karabakh, it should immediately invite them to come to Azerbaijan. In fact, what the Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry should do is publicly demand that everyone who visits Karabakh should also visit Azerbaijan, meet refugees from the conflict, and see both sides of the dispute. I mean, that would be an intelligent thing to do, to engage people who have been to Karabakh and have clearly heard the Armenian perspective. Now, in my case, I've been to Azerbaijan any number of times over the past 30 years. Azerbaijan is not in any way unknown territory for me. But what they're now doing is telling people who will only have experienced the Armenian perspective of this dispute that they're not allowed to experience the Azerbaijani. And that's just foolish.
Setting that aside, now one of the probably biggest developments of this year was the arms deal between Russia and Azerbaijan for $1 billion with very specific types of weapons. How does this change the balance of power in the region and in the conflict specifically?
I don't think this Russian arms sale is terribly important in terms of the overall balance of power by itself. It takes place in a broader context of an arms race between Armenia and Azerbaijan that is very serious. I think if you look closely at this particular Russian arms sale, you can see that it's really not that important. The core of it is T-90 main battle tanks. Now, the T-90 is a tank that the Russian army itself no longer buys. In fact, only a couple of years ago, the Russian Army Chief of Staff publicly denounced the T-90 tank as just a very expensive T-72. Now, the T-72 is the tank that is in the arsenal of Armenia already. The T-90, in this case, I think is a case of Russians selling to Azerbaijan tanks that they don't want themselves because they simply aren't sufficiently modern for the Russian force structure. I think if you actually look at that particular arms sale, it is really more a political than a military action. It is Russia, which is of course a treaty-based security ally of Armenia, trying to maintain its political influence and role in Baku. Obviously, relations between Azerbaijan and the Russian Federation have had some serious problems in recent years, particularly the cancellation of the agreement to allow Russia to continue to maintain the large phase array radar in its strategic rocket forces early warning systems at Gabala. That was something that I think was a significant blow to the quality of the relationship between Moscow and Baku. I think this arms sale is really more politically motivated for Moscow than anything else in an effort to try to keep Russia's hand in Azerbaijan. I think the weapons that Azerbaijan is getting from Turkey, from Israel, Pakistan, and Ukraine are significantly more important in the upgrading of its force structure than are a group of what are essentially very expensive T-72s that just happen to be called T-90s.
Well, one of the very specific type of weapon, and that is the long-range missile Smerch, was a big discussion in Armenia. And then considering the other types being available anywhere else, and so Azerbaijan could have purchased it from others. Smerch became basically one of the, I mean, if everybody in Armenia now knows that word because they talked so much about it, and that was a concentrated discussion about. Do you think this is a political move from Russia to show some kind of to give a sign to Armenia as well, not only to Azerbaijan, considering that there is also, besides the T-72s or the tanks in general or other artillery weapons, this kind of long-range missile is being sold to Azerbaijan?
One of the most important elements of the arms race on both sides is the upgrading of its, what we would call, standoff bombardment capability. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan are preparing for a conflict which would not so much involve infantry and tanks clashing at the sort of line of contact, but would involve both sides bombarding each other at great distances, often bombarding each other's civilian infrastructures, towns, civilian populations, from great distance. This is something which both sides are preparing to do. I think this is actually, in my view, the most disturbing aspect of the arms race between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, the particular weapon systems that are being acquired by both sides is a matter of considerable military detail and technical analysis. But I don't think one can say that this particular group of weapons that are being transferred at full market price from Russia to Azerbaijan fundamentally changed the balance. Keep in mind that Armenia also obtains very sophisticated weapons from Russia and does so at very concessional prices.
The role of the United States, at least within the since the Obama administration took power on Karabakh issue, has been, say, much less visible in the process. Do you think the United States is just busy with foreign policy in other places and left the region with the conflict basically to Russia or others, Europeans maybe? And because even about these weapon sales, there was no sign of any kind of statement from the White House or State Department, wherever it would be from.
Well, I think you do have to recognize the United States has a few other problems to deal with in the world than just the Central Caucasus, and most of them are much more important to the United States. This is a point I tried to emphasize 2 years ago at a presentation that I gave in Yerevan at a conference sponsored by the Ministry of Defense, that the Central Caucasus, all three of the countries, not just Armenia and Azerbaijan, but also Georgia, are really much less important to the United States than the peoples in the three capitals seem to think. This is not an area of primary or even secondary interest to the United States. And the notion that somehow it would rank with the Middle East or with China or with Central America in American priorities is simply wrong. Now, in terms of the actions of the Obama administration, it was extremely supportive of the efforts being undertaken within the Minsk group leading up to the failed summit meeting at Kazan. President Obama and President Sarkozy of France at that time actively, through phone calls, through personal diplomacy, and through international efforts of other kinds, tried to encourage Armenia and Azerbaijan to come to some kind of an agreement on the principles that were to be agreed at Kazan. The failure of Kazan, which involved a very direct effort by the Russian president, the Russian foreign minister, I think has had a very discouraging impact in Paris and in Washington. Look, all three of these countries have tried at the presidential level to get the parties to the Karabakh dispute to at least make some progress. The United States did that at Key West. The French did that under President Chirac. The Russians have done it under Presidents Putin and Medvedev, and it hasn't resulted in very much. It's difficult for me to imagine what the United States now should be doing that it hasn't already tried to do several times. I think that your question implies that somehow the fault on Karabakh lies in Washington. No, I would say the fault on Karabakh lies in Baku and in Yerevan.
No, I didn't mean to put any fault on anybody. I was just suggesting that at least since this administration took power, it may have also been a personal issue. We had a co-chairman who was much more active, like Matt Bryza was under the Bush administration, and then we had a co-chairman who never gave an interview on this issue, for example. Like this also creates somewhat a clear understanding that the interest is either lower, or is this a personal issue? That was my question.
I think the American diplomacy in the early years of this administration was very active and very competent, very professional, very highly skilled, and worked very closely with our Russian and French colleagues. The problem is that the best chance of making some tangible progress on Karabakh within the Minsk Group framework was at Kazan, and Kazan failed.
And what's the reason for Kazan to fail?
Well, everyone knows why Kazan failed, is because there was a statement of principles that was ready to be signed, and the president of Azerbaijan arrived and refused to do so, and presented a new, very different list of principles that he wanted to be considered. And this came as a great shock to the Russian sponsors, who believed that they were going to have a formal signing ceremony. In fact, they had the signing ceremony table and room already set up and ready for the ceremony.
Now, in the bigger context, there's often analysis that status quo is handy for everyone, to all of the parties involved in the conflict. And so they're prolonging it as long as possible until the first basically the trigger of the war, that the renewed possible conflict will happen. Do you believe this notion is true? Would you say the parties are fine with the status quo no matter how dangerous it is, at least from your understanding of it? And the second is, what are the chances, and what would be the circumstances in which a renewed military action could happen?
Well, I think both sides believe that time is on their side. I think both sides are wrong. I think that merely drawing out this conflict is not likely to produce another Cyprus. I mean, I'm very familiar with the Cyprus issue, having worked on it in my diplomatic career. But Cyprus is very different than Karabakh, and I think the people who make comparisons between the two are in error. I think the danger of renewed conflict over Karabakh is very real. I mean, just look at the scale of the arms race that is now going on. Look at the rivalry that exists, not just between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but that each of those countries has a regional great power sponsor. Turkey to Azerbaijan, Russia to Armenia. Look at the potential role in any renewed conflict of Iran. Look at the issues that affect broader international peace and security problems. No, I think it's a very serious issue. And it's not too difficult to imagine a deteriorating situation which would lead to a development of issues that could get out of control. I mean, we are now only 1 year away from the 100th anniversary of the onset of the First World War. If one looks how that started, the two Balkan wars of 1912-1913, the various issues that had divided Serbia from Austria-Hungary, disputes over Bosnia, disputes over other issues in the Balkans, but also the broader context of great power rivalry. It's very easy to see how these things can get out of hand and can overwhelm the ability of even the best diplomacy to try to restrain conflict. And once war starts, it's much, much more difficult to contain than people believe. Once blood is shed, the tendency among political leaders and among publics is to demand that the war continue. Nobody wants to admit that blood has been shed for nothing. So once the blood is shed, then more blood will be shed, essentially to legitimize the blood that already has been shed. That's unfortunately the history of war throughout all of the human experience. I don't think we're any more intelligent today in dealing with these kinds of issues than were people 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago.
Well, the Georgia war is not behind the mountains. 2008 August 5-day war. So oftentimes there are speculations that an possible Armenian-Azerbaijani new war could only be a short war, such as the Georgia-Russia war.
It could be a short war, but assumptions that wars will be short are frequently proven wrong. The most characteristic thing about the war 5 years ago between Georgia and Russia is that it was essentially a punitive expedition by a great power against a much, much smaller regional country, which had itself initiated the conflict. Between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's much greater equality of military standing. A war between Armenia and Azerbaijan would not essentially be a punishment exercise, which is what Russia did to Georgia for having initiated the conflict in South Ossetia. No, I don't think the Georgia-Russia conflict is a good paradigm for understanding a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If nothing else, there's really not that much bad blood on the Russian side towards Georgia, except toward the person of Misha Saakashvili. Whereas between Armenia and Azerbaijan today, there is an enormous amount of bad blood, of demonization of the other on both sides. And that means that the tendency to want to seek revenge, fulfillment, victory through arms in a conflict between those two countries, I think is much more dangerous. And note that I'm not talking about a new conflict over Karabakh. I'm talking about a new conflict between the two republics. I don't think a new war would be limited to Karabakh.
So the whole line, the border, would be basically a war zone.
Well, considering that Azerbaijan considers that Karabakh is its national territory, considering that in the view of all diplomatic processes under consideration, the territories surrounding Karabakh that are occupied by Armenia are part of Azerbaijan. From Baku's point of view, why should an assault against that territory, which it considers to be its own, be any different than a conflict along the border with the Republic of Armenia?
Under Medvedev administration, the United States and the European colleagues have been at least evaluating his role as a constructive one in the Nagorno-Karabakh peace process. Do you agree with this? And has Putin's re-election or taking the position of presidency in Russia changed this?
Oh, I think Medvedev contributed a very great deal of his presidential stature, his time, his attention to trying to get some real progress on Karabakh. I think it must have been a huge disappointment to him to face the failure of those efforts at Kazan. My impression is that Vladimir Putin simply doesn't take the two conflicting parties, Armenia and Azerbaijan, seriously as potential negotiating partners. I think he looks upon both people in Yerevan and Baku as sort of teenagers who don't know how to behave. I don't think he takes either side that seriously.
Last question. With the limbo or the deadlock, if you wish, after Kazan, so far there hasn't been really a meeting between the presidents. Can we say that basically the diplomacy, the chances with the diplomatic solution for peace are evaporating further and we're just going to get ready for another war?
Well, my own view, and I have said this in writing and in public, is that a different kind of diplomatic approach is called for. The problem with the Minsk Group process is that it is a mediation process, and mediators do not negotiate. Mediators only mediate. If the parties to a conflict will not negotiate, then the best mediators who ever lived can achieve very little. I think the mediation process within the Minsk Group has tried very, very hard over a number of years to try to bring about a genuine negotiation. I don't think it's the fault of the Minsk Group negotiators that they have been unable to do that. I think now what's called for is a different kind of diplomatic approach, and in my view, that now requires a much bigger role for Turkey. Turkey is the other regional great power along with Russia. Turkey has a obviously special role with Azerbaijan. It has a common border with both Azerbaijan in Nakhchivan and with Armenia. And Turkey today plays a much, much different regional role than it did when the Minsk Group process was initiated almost 20 years ago. I think now that the need for really important regional great power diplomacy, which I mean diplomacy between Ankara and Moscow, to bring about a much more coercive form of regional great power intervention to force essentially the two conflicting parties into real negotiations is the only way to prevent another war.
How acceptable would that be from the Armenian perspective?
I would think it would be almost equally unacceptable from the Azerbaijani perspective. But that's not my perspective. My perspective as an American is one who has found it very difficult to imagine how to prevent another renewed war in the Caucasus without the regional great powers, by which I mean Russia and Turkey, jointly effecting a diplomatic solution. I've thought about this very long and very hard for almost 20 years, and I have exhausted in my own mind all the other options that I think have potential. Now, I'm not saying that great power collusion between Turkey and Russia on this issue would necessarily be successful. It very well might fail. But it is at least an alternative to the current process, which has not been tried and which I think actually could break things free from the current logjam that exists diplomatically in the Central Caucasus today.
Just as you mentioned, the great powers in the region, is there a spot for Iran, which obviously has its own interests, having the border and political interests, especially in the light of changing political power in Iran today?
Well, in theory, one would want to include all three of the regional great powers. Unfortunately, Iranian diplomacy and Iranian politics make that simply unfeasible for as far as anyone can see. An active Iranian role would be unacceptable, I'm sure, to Moscow and Ankara and Baku and Yerevan. I mean, probably the only thing that all four of those can all agree on is they don't want an Iranian direct role. At some point in the future, if Iranian politics really does change in a more positive way, Iran might actually have some role to play in peace implementation, peacekeeping, and the development of a normalized process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But in terms of a new diplomatic initiative to bring about a breakthrough on negotiations, I'm simply incapable of seeing how Iran could play a positive role.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Murray, thank you for your time, and thanks for coming to Voice of
My
America.
pleasure.